Jason Statham grabbed the biggest guy in the gym by the throat and pinned him against the mirror so hard the glass cracked from the base to the ceiling. The man's feet dangled 2 inches off the ground, his face turning purple, his training partners frozen mid-rep like somebody hit pause on the whole room. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become South London gym legend, a story whispered about for decades, the kind of tale that trainers still tell new members when they ask about the crack in that mirror that never got replaced. But let me back up, just 15 minutes. Because you need to understand how a Hollywood action star ended up choking a man twice his width in a basement gym that smelled like rust and old sweat. It was a Tuesday. Statham was back in London between films. No entourage, no cameras. Just a gray hoodie, a pair of beaten trainers, and a gym bag he'd been carrying to this same spot since the mid-90s. See, before the movies, before the Fast and Furious franchise and the Transporter films, Statham was a competitive diver for the British national team and a street market hustler in Great Yarmouth. He didn't learn to fight on a movie set. He learned to fight because he had to. And this gym, Iron House, tucked underneath a row of shops in Bermondsey, was where he kept sharp. No membership fees for him. The owner, a retired boxer named George, had known Statham since he was selling fake perfume out of a suitcase. They had an understanding. Statham could train whenever he wanted, however he wanted, and nobody bothered him. Believe me, that arrangement was about to get tested. Statham walked down the concrete steps at around 10 in the morning. The gym was half full, maybe 15 guys spread across the floor. Free weights on the left, heavy bags in the back, one squat rack that everybody fought over. And in the far corner, near the cable machines, there was a man named David Mensah, late 20s, Ghanaian-born, raised in Peckham, built solid but not massive, maybe 5'10", 170 pounds. David had been coming to Iron House for about 3 months. He kept his head down, trained hard, wore earbuds, minded his business. George liked him. Said he was polite, paid on time, never left his weights on the floor. But there was a problem, and that problem had a name. Actually, it had 3 names. Kyle Branson, Declan Watts, and a guy everybody just called Riggs. 3 local guys, late 20s, early 30s. They trained together every morning. They were big, not gym model big, street big, thick necks, cropped hair, matching attitudes. Kyle was the leader. 6'2", maybe 220, forearms covered in tattoos. He talked the most. He talked constantly, actually. And for the past 3 weeks, he'd been targeting David Mensah. It started small, comments under the breath when David walked past, kicking his water bottle off the bench, standing too close during sets. Then it escalated. One day, Kyle pulled David's earbuds out and told him this gym was for locals. Another day, Declan dropped a 20-kilo plate next to David's foot while he was stretching, close enough to feel the wind, and said, "Oops, here's what nobody tells you." David reported it to George. George talked to Kyle. Kyle denied everything, and the next day the harassment doubled. That Tuesday morning, Statham was wrapping his hands near the heavy bags when he heard it. Kyle's voice, loud, cutting through the clanking iron. "Oi, kunta kinte. You're on my bench." David pulled his earbuds out. He was sitting on the flat bench press, mid-set, bar loaded with 80 kilos. He looked at Kyle, who was standing over him with Declan and Riggs flanking either side. "I've got 2 sets left," David said. Calm, measured. Did I stutter? Kyle leaned down, hands on his knees, face 6 inches from David's. "Get off my bench." David stood up, not because he was afraid, because he'd calculated the math. 3 against 1, no witnesses who'd back him, and a gym membership he couldn't afford to lose. He picked up his towel, stepped aside. Kyle sat down on the bench and didn't even use it. Just sat there, scrolling his phone, grinning. Statham watched this from 30 feet away. His jaw tightened. His hands stopped wrapping. He stood completely still for about 5 seconds, which, if you know anything about Statham, that stillness is the most dangerous thing in the room. He pulled the wraps off his hands, slowly, deliberately, and he walked toward the bench press area. Now, I need you to understand something about Iron House. It wasn't a commercial gym. There was no front desk staff, no security cameras. George was usually in his office upstairs doing paperwork until noon. The rules down here were enforced by reputation, and right now, Kyle Branson's reputation was the loudest voice in the room. That was about to change. Statham stopped about 6 feet from the bench. He didn't say anything yet, just stood there. Kyle noticed him but didn't register who he was. The hoodie was pulled up. Statham looked like any other gym regular. "You waiting for the bench too, mate?" Kyle said without looking up from his phone. "Take a number." "I'm not waiting for the bench." Kyle looked up. Something about the voice made him pay attention. His eyes narrowed, then widened slightly. Recognition flickered across his face, then he buried it with a smirk. No way. Jason Statham? In this dump? Statham didn't respond to that. He tilted his head toward David, who was now standing near the water fountain, pretending to refill his bottle but clearly listening. "That man was using the bench. You took it from him." Kyle leaned back on the bench, spreading his arms wide. He moved. I sat down. "Free country, innit?" Statham took one step closer. "He moved because you and your 2 mates boxed him in. I watched it happen. Get this. The entire gym had gone quiet. Every rep stopped, every conversation cut short. 15 guys standing around with dumbbells dangling at their sides, watching this unfold." Kyle stood up from the bench. He was taller than Statham by 3 inches and heavier by at least 30 pounds. He squared his shoulders, the way guys do when they're deciding whether to push a situation or back down. "Listen, bruv, I don't care if you're in movies. This isn't a film set. This is my gym. I train here every day. That bloke's been here 5 minutes and thinks he owns the place. So maybe you should go back to your heavy bag and mind your business." Statham didn't blink. "Call him that name again." "What name?" "The name you called him when you told him to move." Kyle's jaw worked side to side. Declan stepped up beside him and Riggs shifted to the other side. 3 men forming a wall. Statham hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't balled his fists. But something in the room changed. The temperature dropped about 10 degrees. "I called him what he is," Kyle said. And that's when Statham moved. Now here's the thing about the way Jason Statham fights in real life versus on screen. In the movies, there's choreography. There are wires, pads, stunt doubles, camera angles designed to make everything look clean and spectacular. In real life, Statham is a student of Wing Chun Kung Fu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and kickboxing. He trained with guys who actually fight. Real combat isn't pretty. It's fast, it's brutal, and it's over before you realize it started. Kyle never saw the hand coming. Statham closed those 6 feet in what seemed like one stride, shot his right hand straight to Kyle's throat. Not the windpipe, but the muscles on the side of the neck. A grip that controlled blood flow and movement simultaneously. His left hand grabbed the back of Kyle's shirt. In one motion, he spun Kyle around and slammed him back first into the wall-length mirror behind the bench press area. The glass cracked. Kyle's eyes went wide. His hands clawed at Statham's forearm but couldn't break the grip. His feet lifted off the ground. That's where we started, remember? Guy against the mirror, glass cracking, room frozen. Declan lunged forward. Statham didn't even look at him. He shot his left foot back in a low kick that caught Declan square on the kneecap. Declan crumpled sideways, grabbing at a bench for support, his leg buckling under him. He went down hard on one knee and stayed there, cursing through gritted teeth. Riggs didn't move. Smart man. Statham turned his full attention back to Kyle, who was still suspended against the cracked mirror. Kyle's face had gone from purple to a deep red. He was trying to speak but could only manage wheezing sounds. "I swear this happened." Statham held him there for a full 10 seconds without saying a word, just staring. And then he leaned in close enough that only Kyle could hear him. "You've been coming to this gym, harassing a man who's done nothing to you, because you think being big and having 2 mates behind you makes you untouchable. Let me explain something. You are not untouchable." He released his grip. Kyle slid down the mirror and landed on his backside, gasping, one hand on his throat. The broken glass above him made a web of fractures spreading across the wall, but Statham wasn't done. He turned to face the rest of the gym. Every single person in there was watching. Some had their phones out. Nobody was recording, though. You didn't record things at Iron House. It was an unwritten rule. Whatever happened in the basement stayed in the basement. "Did anybody else see what's been going on?" Statham said. Not shouting, conversational, silence. 3 weeks, Statham continued. 3 weeks this man has been harassed in here. racial slurs, intimidation, stolen equipment, and none of you said a word. A guy near the squat rack shifted his weight. Another one looked at the floor. David Mensa stood by the water fountain, towel over his shoulder, watching. His expression was hard to read, surprise mostly, but underneath it, something that looked close to relief. "I've trained in gyms all over the world," Statham said. "You know what the best ones have in common? It's not the equipment, it's not the space. It's that everyone in there earns their spot the same way, by showing up and putting in the work. That's it." He pointed at Kyle, who was still sitting against the broken mirror, rubbing his neck. "That man doesn't train, he performs. He comes here to feel powerful, and he picked the one person he thought nobody would defend. Trust me on this." The room was charged. You could see guys rethinking every time they'd looked the other way, every time they'd heard Kyle run his mouth and decided it wasn't their problem. Statham walked over to David. He stopped about 3 feet away and extended his hand. Not dramatically, not for show, just one man offering a handshake to another. David took it. Firm grip, short shake. "What's your name?" Statham asked. "David." "David, how long you been training?" "About 6 months total. 3 months here." Statham nodded. "You were doing 80 kilos on the bench?" "Working up to it. Was my 3rd set." Statham turned back toward the bench press. Kyle was now being helped up by Declan, who had limped over, his knee clearly in bad shape. Riggs stood off to the side, arms crossed, looking at the ceiling. Kyle's head snapped up. His eyes were watery, not from crying, from the choking. His voice came out raspy. "What?" "David's going to finish his sets. You're going to spot him." You should have seen the look on Kyle's face. Confusion mixed with fury, mixed with the slow realization that he was not in control of this situation, had never been in control, and that his entire power structure had been dismantled in under 60 seconds by a man 6 inches shorter who wasn't even breathing hard. "I'm not spotting anyone," Kyle started. Statham took 1 step toward him. Kyle shut his mouth. "This is the real stuff, people. This isn't a movie scene. This isn't scripted. This is a man who spent his whole life understanding one thing: power respects power, and bullies are only brave when the math is in their favor." Statham changed the math. David walked back to the bench. He sat down, adjusted his grip on the bar. Kyle stood behind the bench, jaw clenched, hands hovering near the bar in the spotter position. David pressed the 80 kilos. 1 rep, 2, 3, clean form, controlled. 4, 5, racked it. Nobody else in the gym moved during those 5 reps. It was the quietest that room had ever been. When David finished, he stood up and gave Kyle a nod. Not a mocking nod, not a victory lap, just an acknowledgement, one man to another. Kyle didn't return it. His nostrils flared, his chest heaved, but he didn't say a word. Statham walked back toward the heavy bags. But before he got there, something happened that changed the whole texture of this story. David followed him. "Hey, Jason." Statham turned. "Thank you. But you didn't have to do that. I've dealt with guys like him my whole life." Statham looked at David for a long moment. And then he said something that the 3 or 4 people close enough to hear would later repeat, word for word, to anyone who'd listen. "I know you have. That's the problem." And right there, in those 8 words, was everything. Not a lecture, not a sermon, not a social media post. Just a recognition that David Mensa's ability to endure abuse shouldn't be the thing that allows the abuse to continue. Statham went back to the heavy bags, started hitting them. Boom, boom, boom. Each strike crisp, each combination flowing into the next. The gym slowly cranked back up, weight started moving, conversations resumed at half volume. But the atmosphere was different now. The air had been cleared, and everybody in that room knew it. Now, here's where things could have ended. And if this were a movie, they probably would have. Hero steps in, bad guy gets humbled, credits roll. But this is real life, and real life has a second act that movies don't show you. Here's the part most people miss. About 20 minutes later, George came downstairs. He saw the cracked mirror. He looked around the gym. You could tell from his face that he knew something had gone down. He walked over to Statham, who was now on the speed bag. "What happened to my mirror?" Statham stopped hitting the bag. "Kyle Branson happened to your mirror." George looked across the gym at Kyle, who was now doing bicep curls in the far corner, headphones on, pretending the last half hour hadn't occurred. What'd he do? Same thing he's been doing. Except today, somebody was here who gave a damn. George rubbed his face with both hands. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from knowing about a problem and hoping it goes away on its own. I talked to him about it, Jay. Twice. Talking didn't work. So you put him through my mirror? I'll pay for the mirror. George stood there for a moment, then shook his head. No, leave it. I'll leave it cracked. Let it be a reminder. And that, my friends, is why that mirror is still cracked to this day. True story. If you know someone who trains at Iron House in Bermondsey, ask them about the mirror. They'll know exactly what you're talking about. But we're not done. Because the real story isn't the confrontation. The real story is what happened after. Over the next 2 hours while Statham trained, 3 separate people approached David Mensah. 3 guys who had been in that gym for months, who had seen what Kyle was doing, and who had said nothing. The first was a bricklayer named Terry, built like a fire hydrant. He walked up to David between sets and said, "I should have said something weeks ago. My bad." David just nodded. The second was a younger guy, maybe 22, who trained in the mornings before his shift at a warehouse. He didn't say much, just came over, asked David if he wanted to work in on the cable machine, and that was that. A small gesture. But if you've ever been the outsider in a room, you know that a small gesture can feel enormous. The third was Riggs. No kidding. Riggs walked over to David, looked around to make sure Kyle and Declan weren't watching, and said, "Kyle's my cousin. I go along with his nonsense because it's easier than fighting him on it. But it's not right. I know it's not right." David looked at Riggs for a long beat. Then he said, "Easier for who?" Riggs didn't have an answer for that. He walked away. But listen closely. 2 weeks later, Riggs stopped training with Kyle altogether. Started coming to the gym at different hours. Didn't make a big announcement about it. Just quietly removed himself from the equation. Sometimes that's what courage looks like. Not a dramatic stand, just a quiet decision to stop being part of the problem. And Kyle? Here's what happened to Kyle Branson. For about a week after the incident, Kyle kept coming to Iron House. But the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the alpha in the room. People didn't clear space when he walked by. Nobody laughed at his jokes. He'd lost his audience. And without an audience, a bully is just a loud guy that everyone avoids. On the 8th day, Kyle walked into the gym and found David on the bench press again. Same bench, same spot. David looked up, saw Kyle, and didn't move, didn't flinch, just kept pressing. Kyle stood there for maybe 5 seconds. Then he walked to a different bench. That was the moment. Not the mirror, not the choking, not Statham's intervention. That was the moment the power shifted for good. Because it wasn't Statham standing in Kyle's way anymore. It was David standing in his own ground. Kyle stopped coming to Iron House 2 weeks later. I heard from George that he joined a commercial gym in Canary Wharf, the kind with smoothie bars and towel service. Good riddance. But the story has one more turn. And honestly, this is the part that gets me. About a month after the incident, Statham was back in London for a weekend. He came to Iron House on a Saturday morning. Early. The gym was nearly empty. Just him, George, and one other person, David. They trained in the same space for about an hour. Didn't talk much. Statham on the bags, David on the free weights. 2 guys putting in work. But near the end, they found themselves at the water fountain at the same time. Statham filled his bottle. David waited behind him. When Statham finished, he stepped aside and said, "How's things?" David said, "Good. Nobody's bothered me since." Statham nodded. And then David said something that caught Statham off guard. "My dad died when I was 12, back in Ghana. He worked on a cocoa farm. Every morning before he went out, he'd say the same thing to me. 'Stand where you stand, David. Don't let anyone move you from your spot.' I forgot that for a while. You reminded me. Mark my words. Statham is not a man who shows emotion easily. He's built a career on the stone face, the hard stare, the unbreakable exterior. But in that moment, something shifted behind his eyes. He looked down at the water fountain, swallowed once, then looked back up at David. 'Your dad sounds like he was a smart man.' He was. Then he raised a strong son." That was it. No hug, no dramatic music. Just 2 men at a water fountain in a basement gym in South London, connected by something bigger than a confrontation with a bully, connected by the understanding that strength isn't about how much you can bench or how hard you can hit. It's about standing where you stand. Now, I want to pause here for 1 second. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this don't get told enough, and the only way they spread is through people like you. That's it. That's my ask. Back to the story. Because there's a final piece to this puzzle, and it ties everything together. 6 months later, George decided to expand Iron House. He knocked through a wall into the adjacent basement, added new equipment, put in proper ventilation for the first time in 20 years. The gym doubled in size, and when it reopened, George put up a small plaque near the entrance. Nothing flashy, just a metal plate bolted to the brick wall. It said, "Every person who walks through this door earns their spot the same way, by showing up and putting in the work." George never told anyone where the quote came from. But if you were in that gym on that Tuesday morning, you knew. David Mensa still trains at Iron House, 5 days a week. He's up to 110 kilos on the bench now, for real. He started a Saturday morning training group for teenagers in the area, kids who don't have gym memberships, kids who need a place to go. George lets them use the space for free. David runs the sessions himself, and every now and then when Statham is in London, he drops in. No announcement, no fanfare, just the gray hoodie and the beaten trainers. He hits the bags. He nods at David. Sometimes they train together, sometimes they don't. But here's the thing that stays with me about this whole story. It's not the physical confrontation, it's not the cracked mirror or Kyle Branson's humiliation, it's the choice. Statham didn't have to get involved. He was a celebrity in a dingy gym. He could have kept his head down, finished his workout, and flown back to Los Angeles without a second thought. Nobody would have blamed him, nobody would have even known. But he saw something wrong, and he moved toward it. Not away from it, not around it, toward it. And David didn't have to stay at Iron House after what happened. He could have found another gym, avoided the drama, taken the easier path, but he stood where he stood. That's what real strength is, not the ability to pin a man against a mirror. That's force. Force fades the moment you let go. Strength is the decision to stay, to show up again tomorrow, and to build something in the same spot where somebody tried to tear you down. The crack in that mirror is still there. 8 years and counting. George has repainted the walls, replaced the flooring, upgraded every piece of equipment in the building. But that mirror stays, cracked from base to ceiling. New members ask about it. The regulars just smile. Because everyone at Iron House knows the story. The story of a Tuesday morning when a movie star reminded a room full of grown men what courage actually looks like. Not the kind you see on screen with explosions and car chases. The real kind. The kind that starts with 2 feet planted on the ground and a refusal to look the other way. Statham never talked about this publicly. No interviews, no social media posts, no PR team spinning it into a headline. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because it was right. And David Mensa never went to the press either. He didn't want to be a symbol or a victim or a story. He just wanted to train. But stories like this have a way of traveling. Gym to gym, barbershop to barbershop, pub to pub, until somebody like me hears it and decides that it needs to be told. Because in a world that sometimes feels like it's full of Kyle Bransons, people who mistake volume for authority and cruelty for power, we need to remember that there are Jason Stathams out there. Not movie characters, real people. People who see something wrong and choose in that critical 5-second window where most of us hesitate to act. And we need to remember that there are David Mensas. People who absorb punishment they don't deserve, who show up every day to spaces that haven't always welcomed them, and who build something lasting in the aftermath of someone else's destruction. The gym is still open. The mirror is still cracked. The plaque is still on the wall. And every Tuesday morning, David Mensa sits down on that bench press, wraps his hands around the bar, and presses. Nobody tells him to move. Not anymore.